My name is Evelyn Harper, and I'm 18 years old. People think silence in a house means peace, but they're wrong. There's a kind of silence that isn't calm at all. It's hollow. It echoes in the walls and in your chest until you feel like you could scream and nobody would even turn their head. That's the silence I grew up in. That was the diary entry I wrote 9 years ago, back when I still believed I could earn my place in this family. I'm 27 now, and my name is Lena. But standing outside the heavy walnut doors of the Harper Tower penthouse in Chicago, that same hollow silence was screaming at me again. I wasn't here for a reunion. I had been summoned. My father's executive assistant had called it a mandatory family restructuring meeting. The phrase itself felt cold, metallic, and forbidding. I smoothed the front of my blazer, took a breath that tasted like recycled air and expensive carpet cleaner, and pushed the doors open. The penthouse looked exactly as it had when I left, like a museum where nothing was ever meant to be lived in. My family was arranged in the living room like a tribunal. Thomas, my father, sat in his high-backed leather chair, fingers steepled. Margaret, my mother, perched stiffly on the edge of the sofa. My siblings, Claire and Ethan, stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, scrolling through their phones with identical expressions of bored superiority. No one stood when I entered. No one smiled. Thomas didn't waste time with pleasantries. He cleared his throat and told me to sit. He said we needed to talk about the Harper Group. He said my lifestyle was becoming a liability. He called it a wandering lifestyle. He said the words travel creator, the way someone might say infestation. He said Harper Properties represented stability, heritage, and discretion, and that my online presence, my constant movement, my refusal to settle down was eroding the family image. He slid a neat stack of legal documents across the glass coffee table. It was a formal disownment. They were revoking my access to the family trust, removing me from the will, legally severing ties to protect the integrity of the estate. Then he held out his hand. He wanted the black card, the family card, the symbol of everything I was supposedly losing. I looked at him. I looked at the man who raised me to believe worth could be measured by addresses and last names. And then I saw it. A detail so small no one else would have noticed. The cuff of his custom shirt was fraying, just slightly. A single loose thread dangled near his watch. I looked around the room. The fresh orchids were gone, replaced by silk replicas. The thermostat was set 2 degrees warmer than usual, and suddenly I understood. This wasn't about my reputation. This was about money. There's a specific psychology to a declining dynasty. When a wealthy family starts losing its real power, its money, it tightens its grip on symbolic power, its status. They were bleeding cash. They were drowning. And instead of asking for help, they were cutting me loose, pruning what they thought was dead weight to keep their sinking balloon afloat a little longer. They thought I was the burden. They thought I was the expense they could no longer afford. It was a fascinating illusion. The emptier their accounts became, the louder their arrogance grew. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't defend myself. I reached into my purse, pulled out the black card, and let it drop onto the table. It made a sharp plastic click against the glass. Then I picked up the pen and signed. The scratch of ink was the only sound in the room. I signed away my inheritance. I signed away my name. I signed away the last obligation to people who saw me as a line item to be deleted. I stood. I looked at Claire and Ethan, smirking, convinced they'd just secured a larger slice of the pie. They didn't realize the pie was already ash. I walked out without saying goodbye. The silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was final, like the clean drop of a blade. I took the elevator down 50 floors, past the doorman who had watched me grow up, and stepped onto the curb. I didn't call a rideshare. A black SUV with tinted windows was already waiting. The driver opened the door. "Midway Airfield," I said as I slid inside. I unlocked the secure app on my phone, the one that actually ran my life. My family thought I was a travel creator because that's what I let them see. Photos in Santa Monica, Austin, Miami, laptop captions and sunsets. What they didn't see was the code, the contracts, the infrastructure. I am the founder of Atlas Haven, a decentralized living and work network. While the Harpers were polishing brass on a sinking ship, I was building lifeboats. We didn't own buildings, we owned access. We owned the network. 20 minutes later, the SUV rolled onto the private tarmac outside Aurora, Illinois. My jet was already waiting. It wasn't a charter, it was mine. I walked up the stairs, and the attendant handed me a glass of water and a tablet. We were in the final stretch of closing our Series C round. I scrolled through the numbers as the engines began to hum. $400 million in fresh capital, a post-money valuation of $1.3 billion. I leaned back as the jet lifted into the sky and the city shrank beneath me. Somewhere in that grid of lights, my father was probably pouring a drink he could no longer justify, congratulating himself on cutting costs. Over the next year, I watched them from a distance. It was like watching a slow-motion collapse. The headlines came quietly at first. Harper Group misses earnings. Harper Group explores strategic alternatives. I noticed the small fractures before the public ever did. Ethan wrecked a leased McLaren and tried to bury the incident, but the lender sued for breach of contract. Claire, newly titled Vice President of Brand Identity, began cutting housekeeping staff to save payroll, triggering a backlash that spread faster than their PR team could contain. The gap between how they saw themselves and what they actually were widened every week. They still hosted galas, still posed for charity photos, still wore borrowed jewelry and smiled for the cameras, but I knew the truth. I knew because I was buying the data. Occupancy rates were collapsing. Lenders were circling. They were using one property to service the interest on another, a shell game with no shells left. Then the call came. It was a Tuesday evening, exactly 14 months after I'd walked out of the penthouse. My phone vibrated on my desk. It was my mother. I hadn't heard her voice since the disownment. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Margaret," I said. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize. Her voice was tight and clipped. "Your father isn't well. The stress is affecting his heart. We need to discuss the estate. Dinner, Saturday, the Flagship Hotel, 7 o'clock. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order. Even now, with their foundation crumbling, they believed they could summon me. They still thought I was the difficult child who needed correcting. I'll be there." And I ended the call. I didn't book a commercial flight. I told my pilot to prep the jet. I cleared my schedule. Then I called my legal team. I need the full Harper debt profile, every note, every lien. I landed Saturday afternoon and went straight to the Flagship Harper Hotel in downtown Chicago. The smell hit me the moment I walked in. Dust, old carpet, quiet panic. The high-traffic areas were worn thin. The floral arrangements were gone. The staff looked exhausted and understaffed. 3 bulbs in the chandelier were burnt out. It was subtle but unmistakable. This was a dying organism. I took the private elevator to the owner's dining room. They were already seated. Thomas looked smaller, grayer. His suit hung loose on his shoulders. Margaret wore diamonds insured for more than their available cash. Claire and Ethan drank wine with restless hands. "Sit down, Lena," Thomas said. I sat. I didn't reach for the water. I didn't touch the napkin. I waited. "We're in a challenging position," he said, staring at his plate. "The market has been unkind to traditional real estate." He paused, expecting sympathy. I gave him none. "We have a solution," Margaret cut in. She gestured to the empty chair beside me. "Mr. Caldwell is a very well-positioned investor. He's interested in preserving the Harper lineage, and he's very interested in you." The room tilted. "You want me to marry him," I said. It wasn't a question. "It's a strategic alliance," Thomas snapped. "It's what's best for the family. You've been drifting long enough. It's time you contributed something meaningful." He said Mr. Caldwell would cover their short-term obligations in exchange for a union. Old-fashioned, proper. They weren't asking for help. They were selling me, trading me like an asset to secure liquidity. They still saw me as something to be spent. I looked at Ethan. He was staring at the ceiling. I looked at Claire. She was examining her nails. They all knew. They had agreed to this. Is that it? I asked. That's it? That's it, Thomas said. You'll be gracious. You'll accept his proposal. You'll save this legacy. I laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that bounced off the walls. I laughed because it was absurd. I laughed because they were small. I laughed because they had no idea who was sitting at their table. I reached into my bag. I didn't pull out a compact or a tissue. I pulled out my tablet. The screen lit up the room. The shift was instant. I was no longer the daughter. I was no longer the problem. I was the authority. Let's look at the numbers, I said, my voice dropping, steady and flat. Harper Group. Total liabilities, $118 million. Primary toxic assets, the downtown flagship, the waterfront property in Michigan, and this building. Debt service coverage ratio below 0.6. You're in default on 3 covenants. The room froze. Thomas's face drained of color. What are you doing? Ethan snapped. Put that away. I ignored him. The debt was bundled and sold 6 months ago, I continued. Distressed notes, due in full in 30 days. The primary holder is a firm called North Shore Equity. Margaret gasped. She knew the name. Everyone did. North Shore didn't restructure. North Shore liquidated. They're a partner, Thomas stammered. We're negotiating. No, I said. They're not a partner. They want the keys. Ethan stood, red-faced. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a useless influencer. I reached into my bag again and pulled out a thick blue folder. I slid it across the table. It stopped in front of my father. North Shore exercised the foreclosure clause on this property this morning, I said. You didn't get the notice because I asked the attorneys to wait until I delivered it myself. His hands shook. The silverware rattled. How do you have this? He whispered. I leaned forward. Because I bought the debt, Thomas. I bought all of it through a holding company for pennies on the dollar. I paused. I am North Shore Equity. The silence was absolute. It was heavy, final. They weren't looking at a daughter anymore. They were looking at the owner. We did it for the family, Thomas rasped. We did what was best. I stood and walked to the window. You pushed me out, I said. You thought the edge was weakness, but the edge is where you see the future. I turned back to them. While you were fighting over titles and traditions, I was building infrastructure. He begged. He pleaded. I didn't feel anything. Destroying them would have been easy and boring. I'm acquiring the Harper Group, I said. It's being folded into Atlas Haven. Every property will be rebranded. Flexible living, tech-enabled hubs. You can't, Ethan said weakly. It's our heritage. It's my asset, I corrected. I slid the contracts across the table. I'm offering you jobs. Claire, you'll manage customer experience, front desk, complaints, guests. Ethan, procurement, budgets, supplies. You'll learn what money actually is. Thomas, you're retired, effective immediately. You'll vacate the penthouse by Friday. The pen sat between us, heavy, trembling. He signed. One by one, they all did. I took the contract, put it in my bag, and walked out. I didn't look back. I checked my phone. The rebrand was already live. I hadn't burned the house down. I'd rebuilt it. There's a special kind of justice in growing something from soil that tried to bury you. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's ownership. I unlocked my apartment door that night. It was quiet, not hollow, solid, peaceful, entirely mine. If this story resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and comment below with your perspective or the key lesson you took from this story.